Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining the stream today. I'm with my friend Jonathan McLatchie, and we are here to talk about your doubts. And so we are going to talk about evidence for the New Testament, particularly in the case for miracles. And normally, when we talk about miracles in the New Testament and different things like that, we would talk about the resurrection. But Jonathan's just going to share some really good information that we've been talking about kind of back and forth and doing on calls. We talk about doubts. We'll talk about that in a second, about the case for miracles that you could actually establish just from the New Testament, like the raising of Lazarus and different miracles from the book of Acts and different things like that. And then afterwards, and I'll repeat this kind of throughout the stream as more people join. After the presentation, we will take some of your calls. So if you have questions about the New Testament, if you maybe have nagging doubts, maybe you've heard some stuff on YouTube that you can't trust the reliability of the Gospels, that they're unreliable, that we don't know who wrote them, that they're just untrustworthy documents, then we want to talk to you, whether you're a Christian, that this is just kind of bothering you, or you are somebody who is willing to examine the evidence fairly, and maybe you're a non-believer, but you just want more information. We definitely want to talk to you. Now, before we get started, I do want to talk about doubts super quick here. Jonathan, you want to talk about what we do?
Sure. So, Talk About Doubts is a ministry that I launched in its current form in 2021, and essentially, we offer free private mentoring to Christians who struggle with doubts about faith. So, we have assembled a team of more than 70 scholars and volunteers in various academic subjects who are willing to schedule private Zoom calls to talk about people's doubts with them in confidence. And so, the way it works is someone comes to our website, talkaboutdoubts.com, and they submit a contact form, and then we distribute that to one of our volunteer experts who will then get in contact with the inquirer to schedule a private Zoom call. And these are sometimes one-on-one or sometimes two-on-one calls. Our target audience is people who are struggling with doubts about faith. They might be Christians, but who are considering deconversion, or people who are already former Christians who want to explore whether there's a rational path back to faith, as well as non-Christian seekers who are interested in sincerely exploring the evidences of Christianity. So if that's you, feel free to submit a contact form, and we will be glad to talk to you privately about the evidence for the truth of the gospel, and or addressing any particular objections or concerns that you have.
Yep, definitely. And so this is something that I've been a volunteer for several years. Somebody asked, did I see Wesley Huff, somebody with the Mike Heiser avatar there? Yes, you did. Wesley is a part of the collective. We actually did I think me, you, and I forget who the other person was, but we were doing those kind of four, like a panel asking,
Yeah,
answering questions and different things like that. That was quite a while ago. But back when, before Wesley Huff was like, this internationally known megastar that's doing all this podcast tour. But yeah, lots of really good scholars, not just Wesley Huff. I mean, Max Becker Heitch is a really good philosopher. Dr. Luke Barnes, somebody who I'm sure a lot of people might have seen on like Capturing Christianity or Unbelievable, doing debates on, say, like the teleological argument, like the fine-tuning argument. Dr. Timothy McGrew, just mutual friend of ours, absolutely amazing philosopher, expert in like epistemology, and so many different fields, like with philosophy and different things like that. Philosophy of science, definitely knows a lot about the New Testament as well. Braxton Hunter, I'm sure some of people watching know from YouTube. Dr. Stephen Boyce has been on my channel several times. I've been on his channel. Excellent New Testament scholar, and just tons of other great people here. Titus Kennedy, and we can just go on and on. And so basically the idea is just to have experts in all kinds of different fields to answer your specific question. And we've just seen so many really good testimonies. And I don't know about you, Jonathan, but it's just always super rewarding for me to see when the lights come on and people get the information that, their questions answered, and the information that they've been kind of missing you'll see like these kind of light bulb moments, these aha moments, and it's just like, wow, like just the other day we had somebody who was bothered by just watching one too many myth vision videos, and we just went through, you know, the evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. And he's like, well, why was I even considering this stuff before? These theories just don't make sense in the light of it. And so just testimony after testimony, people coming to Jesus or people just holding on to their faith. And so the whole point of us doing these streams, and it's something that I want to do regularly. Last month, just I was dealing with the flu for like several weeks and just a lot of things going on. And so unfortunately, it didn't work out. But we're going to try and do these at least monthly with either me and you or some of these other scholars. Stephen Boyce has already said yes. Wesley Huff has already said yes. We just got to find something that works for his schedule. And so the idea is just to give people an exposure, a taste of what this is like. And so if you're viewing and you're like, oh, I don't want to come on a live, that's totally fine. Fill out the form. Go to the form, fill it out, and it's super simple, and we'll schedule something with you.
And we'll also be able to go into much more depth than we would be able to do in a live stream as well.
Absolutely. And not only that, but we've done multiple times where we've done multiple calls with people. There's other resources that we get to you. But the whole point of this live is to give people a taste, at least, of what this is, what they can experience from these calls. And so, if you're willing to call and you don't mind, not, you know, just getting it out there on a live, then by all means, we want to talk to you soon. And so I do need to add the link so people can join. That would probably be helpful. But while I'm setting that up, Jonathan, you were going to talk to us a little bit about miracles in the New Testament. And so why don't you kick that off? And I might chime in here and there with some of my own observations. And then after just going into some information to kind of give you guys a taste of some of the things that we talk about, there will be a live link for you guys to join.
Sure. So let me just give you a short introduction to the topic of miracles in the New Testament aside from Jesus' resurrection. One can build this case from the Gospels or from Acts. Let's start with Acts. So the author of Acts, as Eric and I have shown in detail and at length elsewhere, is a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. I'm not going to get into the evidence in detail here, just for brevity's sake, but if you would like to discuss it further, then feel free to hop on and ask about it, and I'll be happy to lay out the case in detail for Luke being a traveling companion of Paul, who is an individual who is very scrupulous as an historian and in the habit of being truthful and reliable in his reportage of information that he has received from apostles, including Paul. And given his being a traveling companion of Paul and his demonstrable track record of scrupulosity as an historian, together with the fact that he's putting his own neck in the line and so forth, this and his own stated interest in eyewitness testimony in his prologue when he's addressing Theophilus, his patron, this builds a strong argument that Luke is receiving information, reliable information, from those who were eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry, purportedly of the resurrection. Paul. He's accurately representing Paul's own conversion testimony on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9, 22 and 26. I have a whole essay where I demonstrate that at length on my website, jonathanmclatchie.com. And Luke also reports various miracles that purportedly took place as well by the hands of Paul as well as other apostles. And given, as I've said, Luke's access to Paul and his scrupulosity as an historian, the fact that we can actually cross-check various aspects of Luke's narrative, not only after Luke has joined Paul as a traveling companion, but also prior to that when Luke is not present, this provides a very strong reason to think that Luke is accurately representing Paul's own testimony, not only concerning his conversion, which Eric and I have both discussed at length elsewhere, but also the miracles that Paul purportedly performed. And but by the way, in fact, let me share my screen here.
Yeah,
if I may.
Absolutely.
Text here. Okay. Here we go. Share. Okay, so in 2 Corinthians 12:12, Paul writes in his own words, in fact, in verse 12, the signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. Is my screen visible, Eric?
It's not seeing it for some reason.
So
Are you doing
I
present?
think, yeah, I think you have to pull it up.
Oh, okay. No, it's not showing. Did you go? What did you do? Did you go to present?
I did present.
Okay.
Enter the window.
Okay. It's just trying to go to my screens. I'm sorry. Bear with me. This is Bush League. Bush League. Apologize, everybody. Going boomer mode here. Let's see. Share screen, slides and PDF, extra camera. Why is it not showing it to me? Let me check settings real quick.
Okay.
Guess.
Well, I'll just keep talking.
Yeah, keep going, and then I'll make sure.
So anyway, in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 12, it says, the signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. And bear in mind that Paul's addressing an audience of skeptics who are, some of them are skeptics, some of them are critical of Paul's apostolic credentials. And so this is a pretty risky thing to be saying if there were no such miracles or signs to speak of. In Romans chapter 15, there's a very similar text where it says, for I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God. And so Paul again speaks about his miracles that he has purportedly performed. Now, he unfortunately doesn't give us any details about those miracles in his letters. However, if we go to the book of Acts, and as we can show, the author of Acts is representing accurately Paul's own testimony concerning his itinerary and travels and so forth, then Acts gives us some insight into what Paul himself was alleging concerning those purported miracles. So to take some examples, if we go over to the book of Acts now, let's take this one, for instance. This is in Acts 13, where Paul actually curses a magician called Bar Jesus, or otherwise known as Elymas. And it tells us that he was with the proconsul Sergius Paulus, a man of intelligence, to summon Barnabas and Saul and sought to hear the word of God. But Elymas, magician, for that's the meaning of his name, opposed them, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. But Saul, who was also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at him and said, you son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, full of all deceit and villainy, will you not stop making crooked the straight path of the Lord? And now behold, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you'll be blind and unable to see the sun for a time. Immediately a mist and darkness fell upon him, and he went about seeking people to lead him by the hand. Then the proconsul believed when he saw what had occurred, for he was astonished at the teaching of the Lord. Now, this is this sort of miracle about which is quite difficult to be sincerely mistaken, that he caused Elymas to go blind on command, and apparently it was so convincing that it actually resulted in the conversion of the proconsul, Sergius Paulus. So that's one example of a miracle in Acts that most likely represents Paul's own testimony. Another example is, if we look at Acts 16, this is one of the prison escapes in Acts. This is one of two prison escapes, the other one being Peter in Acts chapter 12. But in Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas escape from prison. And so remember, they're in Philippi, and Paul and Silas are in prison, and they're singing praises to God. And then there's an earthquake, and they along with all the other prisoners find themselves freed from their shackles. And then the Philippian jailer is about to commit suicide because it was a very severe penalty for letting prisoners escape, especially if they were prisoners who were condemned to death. And he's worried that the prisoners have all escaped, and so he draws his sword about to take his own life. But then he realizes everyone's there because Paul cries out to him and says, "Do not harm yourself. We're all here." And the jailer actually becomes a Christian, and he, along with his whole family, get converted and get baptized. And we read in verse 35, in fact, when it was day, the magistrates sent the police, saying, "Let those men go." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The magistrates have sent to let you go, therefore come out now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They've beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out." The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So they went out of the prison and visited Lydia. And when they had seen the brothers, they encouraged them and departed. Now, what's interesting is this actually relates to an underlying coincidence with, if we go over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul says to the Thessalonians, "For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain, but though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict." So notice Paul's reference here to his shameful treatment in Philippi, and he adds, "as you know." Now, how do the Thessalonians know about this shameful treatment in Philippi? Of course, he's referring to what we just read in Acts 16 about having been imprisoned, beaten publicly, uncondemned, despite being a Roman citizen, which was against Roman law. And in chapter 17, we read that Paul's very next port of call was actually Thessalonica. It says when they had passed through Ephesus and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Now, this is actually on a major Roman highway, the Via Ignatia, and Ephesus and Apollonia were overnight stops on that highway. And so there's a little bit of specialized geographical knowledge that's exhibited by Luke. But they arrive in Thessalonica, and so you can imagine Paul, having just been treated so shamefully in Philippi, arriving in Thessalonica and recounting to the new converts there what just happened to him in Philippi, how he was beaten publicly and thrown into the prison uncondemned despite being a Roman citizen. Now, what's interesting is that, as most scholars agree, and for good reason, the author of Acts does not appear to be using Paul's letters as a source. And here in particular, we're talking about 1 Thessalonians. And if you scroll back to 1 Thessalonians 1, Paul actually emphasizes the conversion of pagans who turned from idolatry. It says, "For they themselves report concerning us the kind of reception we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God." But the author of Acts emphasizes the conversion of pagans. Rather emphasizes the conversion of Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. For we read that Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead, and so on. And it says, verse 4, "Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women." So he emphasizes the conversion of Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. Now, if Acts were using 1 Thessalonians as a source, 1 Thessalonians actually is arguably Paul's earliest letter, along with Galatians. If the author of Acts were using 1 Thessalonians as a source, you would expect there to be more emphasis on the conversion of pagans. Now, 1 Thessalonians actually shows evidence of being addressed to a mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles, Jews and pagans, because there's certain concepts in 1 Thessalonians that make sense to someone that's steeped in Jewish eschatological thought. So these aren't mutually exclusive, but it does tend to point towards independence of Acts in 1 Thessalonians. And therefore, this bolsters the evidential value of this undesigned coincidence, and actually suggests that the author of Acts is actually representing accurately Paul's testimony concerning his experiences in Philippi, which is inextricable from his miraculous prison escape from the Philippian jail. And so this again is something that's of evidential value. There's various other miracles throughout Acts. He performs various healings. He raises Eutychus from the dead after he falls from a third-story window. He heals the father of Publius on Malta in Acts 28. In fact, the Faith Life Study Bible has a list of miracles throughout Acts that are attributed not only to Paul, but also other apostles as well. So, for example, in Acts 2, everyone is awestruck with the miracles done by the apostles. And by the way, as I've discussed at length elsewhere, the author of Acts not only appears to be representing the testimony of Paul, but he also has access to other witnesses of Jesus' life, ministry, purportedly the resurrection, and individuals who are witnesses to other events throughout Acts as well. For example, in verse 16 here in Acts 21, it says, "Some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, bringing us to the house of Nason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we should lodge." Plausibly, he was converted at Pentecost. We're not sure, but certainly early on in the life of the church. And so he is plausibly a witness to some of these events. We also learn in verse 17 and 18 that when we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly, and the following day Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders are present. We know from Galatians 2 that the elders of the Jerusalem church included not only James, brother of Jesus, but also Simon Peter and John, the son of Zebedee, so two of Jesus' most intimate disciples, and Jesus' own brother. And of course, Luke is present with Paul in Caesarea Maritima in Acts 24 for at least 2 years, and so would have had relatively close geographically. It's about 53 miles away from Jerusalem, and so would have had presumably access during that time to witnesses of Jesus' ministry, resurrection, and the life of the events of the early church. And given Luke's scrupulosity as a historian, the fact he's putting his own neck on the line, it seems very, very probable he's accurately representing the testimony of these. We can actually show that the author of Luke, the other volume by the same author, the Gospel of Luke, accurately represents is recording true events, and so he's extracting reliable information from the apostles. And what's interesting also to note is that Luke stays at the house of Philip the evangelist, Philip the deacon, who's appointed to the office of deacon in Acts chapter 6. So he says, on the next day we departed and came to Caesarea, and we entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7 and stayed with him. And Philip the deacon, as we'll see, also is engaged in performing miracles. And so he very probably is the source for much of that content as well. So we read that everyone is awestruck by the miracles done by the apostles in chapter 2. In chapter 3, Peter heals a man lame from birth. The authorities are forced to recognize that a sign has been performed. In chapter 5, the apostles perform many signs and wonders, healings and exorcisms. Peter's mere shadow is healing power. An angel rescues the apostles from prison. There's another miraculous prison escape as well. In chapter 6, Stephen performs signs and wonders. And also Philip performs signs, healings, and exorcisms in Samaria. Philip's signs and miracles amaze Simon the magician. The Spirit of the Lord snatches Philip from the road to Gaza and places him in Azotus. By the way, there's also an instance in chapter 8 where Philip encounters the Ethiopian eunuch, who just so happens to be reading Isaiah 53. That's not a miracle per se, but it is an occasion of special divine providence. By the way, the Faith Life Study Bible here misses out the cursing of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5, where they're struck dead because they lied to the apostles concerning the price purchased for the land, which again is something that's difficult to be sincerely mistaken about, where Peter at a word causes Ananias and Sapphira both to die immediately. In chapter 9, and we've got Paul's conversion, blindness, and healing at the hands of Ananias. So Ananias on command heals Paul's blindness, and this is after Ananias has received a vision concerning Paul, and Paul a vision concerning Ananias, according to Acts 9. And so that's also of evidential value, and I can get into, if people are interested, why we recognize that Acts 9 actually represents Paul's own conversion testimony on the road to Damascus. This is also recounted in chapter 22 and chapter 26 as well, and attributed to Paul's own words. Peter heals Enos and Lydda in chapter 9. Peter raises Tabitha or Dorcas from the dead. An angel rescues Peter from prison. So this is the other great prison escape. In this case, Peter, the apostle. We already looked at how Paul strikes Bar-Jesus or Elymas blind in Acts 13. In Acts 14, Paul and Barnabas perform signs and wonders in Phrygia and Iconium. Paul also heals a man lame from birth. Paul and Barnabas recount the signs and wonders performed among non-Jews in chapter 15. Paul casts out a spirit of divination in chapter 16, and Paul and Silas are freed from prison by an earthquake. We looked at that one already. In chapter 19, God worked extraordinary miracles through Paul, garments that merely touched him of healing power. In chapter 20, Paul raises Eutychus after he falls from a third-story window. In chapter 28, Paul survives a viper's bite on Malta, and this is, I think, a weaker one because, at least today, there are no venomous snakes on Malta, and there was a common belief in the ancient world all snakes were venomous, and also venomous snakes can sometimes give you a dry bite where it doesn't inject venom. So I wouldn't propose too much weight on this particular example. But also on the island of Malta, Paul heals the father of Publius and others. And so cumulatively, it seems quite difficult to envision Paul being sincerely mistaken about that sort of set of claims. And indeed, the other apostles as well, whom I would argue are being represented by the author of Acts. He's accurately representing their testimony. And it's not plausible that Paul was lying, given, as we've discussed elsewhere, the fact that Paul was willing to endure such tremendous hardships, sufferings, and persecutions on account of the gospel's truth. And we can talk about that. To take just one example from the Gospels real quick before we open up for questions, if we go to John 11, which is the resurrection of Lazarus. Now, the disciples are purported to be with Jesus here in Bethany when he raises Lazarus from the dead. And he meets with Martha and Mary, who were sisters of Lazarus, and then he raises Lazarus from the dead. And then in chapter 12, the disciples actually are with Jesus when Jesus has dinner with Lazarus, whom he just raised from the dead. It says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table, and so on. Now, John claims to be an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, particularly in the ending of John chapter 21, and also is alluded to in 1 John chapter 1, and pretty much everyone agrees that whoever wrote the fourth gospel also wrote 1 John, and so you've got a claim to being an eyewitness, and in particular, the disciple whom Jesus loved. I think there's a very strong cumulative case for that, and in particular, a good case that the author of John was the author of the fourth gospel was in fact John the son of Zebedee, which is one of Jesus' most intimate disciples. And in fact, we read here in John 12 that Mary took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. This is the sort of thing that you might expect to be stamped on the memory of an eyewitness. Notice also that we've got this reference to 6 days before Passover, which is found uniquely in John. And then the entrance into Jerusalem, which is the next day, 5 days before Passover. Now, what's interesting is if you go over to the parallel account in Mark, Mark doesn't give us that same timestamp. In fact, he telescopes or condenses the narrative relative to John. He doesn't mention that the arrival in Bethany was the night before, and it wasn't until the morning that he enters Jerusalem. But if we assume for the sake of argument that John is correct, that the entrance to Bethany was 6 days before Passover, and the entrance to Jerusalem was 5 days before Passover, we can actually find each of these 5 days in the Gospel of Mark. So if we go down to verse we go down to verse 11. It says, he entered Jerusalem, went to the temple. When he looked around at everything, it was already late to enter to Bethany with the 12. This would be the evening, 5 days before Passover, if John is correct in his chronology. Verse 12, and the following day when they came from Bethany was hungry. So this would be the morning, 4 days before Passover. Verse 19, when evening came, they went out of the city. This would be the evening, 4 days before Passover. Verse 20, as they passed by in the morning, this would be the morning, 3 days before Passover. And then you have various episodes that transpire that day, culminating in the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talks to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, which is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night. And so we can assume reasonably that this is the evening, 3 days before Passover, and he's on his way back to his accommodation in Bethany and stopping by on the Mount of Olives. So this is the evening then, 3 days before Passover. And then in chapter 14, verse 1, it was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So it synchronizes precisely as we predict, given the chronology of John, in a very casual and incidental and undesigned way that supports the historicity of both Mark and John on these very specific details, including this very specific reference to the arrival in Bethany being 6 days before Passover, which is consistent with John's own claim to being an eyewitness to these events. Moreover, notice the account concerning the behavior of Mary and Martha in John chapter 11 in the context of the resurrection of Lazarus. Peter J. Williams, in his book, Can We Trust the Gospels, which I recommend is a good introduction to this subject of the reliability of the Gospels, he actually, and Lydia McGrew discusses this in a bit more detail in her book, Testimonies to the Truth, but he compares the account here in John 11 concerning these two sisters, Mary and Martha, to a non-parallel account concerning the same individuals in Luke chapter 10. And he notes, let us consider two stories about the sisters, Mary and Martha, recorded in Luke and John. The two narratives are quite different. In John, most of a chapter is taken up with the account of Jesus raising Lazarus, brother of Mary and Martha, from the dead. In Luke, we have the following narrative with no obvious link to John. This is from Luke 10. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. And he goes on, obviously, if John and Luke knew of each other's book, then they could have copied the names, but they certainly did not copy their completely different narratives. Luke gives us a cameo of two contrasting characters, Martha, stressed about practicalities, and Mary, sitting listening to Jesus' teaching and ignoring any of the concerns of our hard-working sister. It's easy to imagine these sisters as contrasting personality types, one an activist and the other more contemplative. In John, we see the same two women after their brother has died. Jesus approaches their village. As soon as Martha hears, she goes to Jesus, while Mary remains seated at home. John 11:20. Immediately, we see a coincidence in the gospel descriptions, not of the event, but of the types of responses. In both Luke and John, Mary sits while Martha acts. In both, Martha does the welcoming. After meeting Jesus, the ever-active Martha secretly sends a message to her sister that Jesus is calling her. Mary then gets up quickly, and those with her think she is going to weep at the tomb. John 11:31. Coming to Jesus, unlike her sister, she fell at his feet. John 11:33. Recall that she was at Jesus' feet in Luke 2. Jesus sees her weeping. John 11:33. Though there is no similar record that Martha weeps. After arriving at the tomb and himself weeping, Jesus commands for the stone to be moved. At this point, Martha says, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." John 11:39. This extremely practical concern misses the point that Jesus is about to raise Lazarus from the dead. What we see is this. There is no obvious reason to conclude that one author has copied the other, but the two narratives present the two characters in ways that accord with each other. This is so in the physical matters of Mary sitting and positioning herself physically at Jesus' feet, but also in the practical concerns of Martha in both accounts. In both stories, she is also the more active. The easiest interpretation of this is that both Luke and John are describing true characters. This model accounts for a lot in a simple way. Other scenarios are possible, but they do not explain things so straightforwardly. You'll also notice that in John 12, Martha is the one who serves dinner, just as she's concerned about practical matters in Luke. Mary's also the one that takes a pound of expensive ointment and anoints the feet of Jesus and wipes his feet with her hair. And we saw in Luke that Mary falls at the feet of Jesus and she's listening to Jesus' teaching and so on. And so very, very consistent character portrayals across two non-parallel accounts in John and Luke. And it doesn't appear that these consistent character portrayals are the product of design. It looks undesigned. This is, in fact, an example of what we call an artless similarity between John and Luke. Subtle ways in which different characters are portrayed in a consistent way. So this, again, suggests that indeed, as he claims to be, the author of the fourth gospel is present for this dinner. And of course, there's a broader set of arguments, too, that bear positively on the identification of the author of the fourth gospel as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And this is the sort of thing, again, that's quite difficult to be honestly mistaken about, namely the resurrection of Lazarus and then having dinner with this man who's just been raised from the dead in a group setting. So that's just a sample of instances where we have, I think, credibly attested miracles aside from the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, definitely. And so the argument is basically there's all of this historical confirmation around these events, and right in these events, embedded in these are these miracle stories. And so, and especially in the case of Luke, we know that he was risking his neck traveling along with Paul. And these are things that are not something that one would easily be mistaken about. And so, yeah, there's just a lot of different things bearing in on this. Now, we've only scratched the surface. To make an argument go through like this, we would probably want to, in addition to strengthen it some more, add whole, document reliability and why we can trust the Gospels. But there is a lot here. And so we're just kind of, like I said, like Jonathan said, scratching the surface. Sorry, I'm trying to look at live chat and talk at the same time, and it's not working very well. But I have less mods than I normally do. So at any rate, so I see Modern Atheism here. He's got a question in regards to this, so I'm gonna bring him up.
Hi,
hey, sir. How's it going?
Good, and you? Hello,
Good.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no
So
problem.
first of all, I would like to say I love your channel, Eric. I'm a skeptic, but you're my favorite apologist. I think the drawings or the memes, they are so funny. Very good. Okay,
Yeah, thank you.
So I have this question, and
Sure.
it's like sometimes when we talk about discrepancies in the Gospels, we hear the term changing something because of theological reasons. And I wanted to ask, how does this work, in terms of us getting the facts straight? I will give you an example. There is a apparent discrepancy between John and the synoptics in when did the cleansing of the temple happen. John seems to place it early at the beginning of the ministry, and the synoptics place it like at the end, close to his arrest. So some scholars have said that John moved this event early because of theological reasons, while other people, for example, in Spanish philosophy, he's made a full video uh, saying that the temple of the cleansing of the temple must have happened 2 times. He's proposing this harmonization. So there are like different opinions. So I guess my first question will be maybe which opinion is yours? Like, do you think the first harmonization is correct, or is it, or did this happen twice? I don't know.
Yeah, I would say both Jonathan and I would agree that this was two separate events.
Okay. Oh,
I don't see any particular reason theologically that makes a whole lot of sense why they would have John would just move it to the beginning of Jesus's ministry.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so I just don't think that you can kind of come up with any sort of theological reason for anything and slide it in there. Even though Inspiring Philosophy and I disagree a little bit on some of the liberties that the gospel writers felt to take regarding the gospels, I thought his video there was pretty much 100% rock solid, and I agreed completely pretty much with what he had there. I do think that it's two different cleansings for all the reasons that he lays out. Another reason why I think it's John is specifically trying to say that there's two cleansing. There was one that happened at the beginning of his ministry. Is if you look at John chapter 2 verse 20, I don't know, Jonathan, if you could share your screen again real quick.
Sure.
You're so good with the Logos Bible software stuff, and feel free to jump in and if I get anything a little off at all. So if you want to go to John chapter 2 verse 20, and I'm sure you probably have a good idea of where I'm trying to go. So this is right after the temple cleansing, and the Jews are upset with him, and they say, well, I'll start with verse 18. The Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then fired back and said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple." So that's very specific. Usually if you're making up a year, you're going to kind of round to like 40 or 50 or, something like that. But 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days. Well, according to Josephus, in Antiquities, I believe it's 1511.1.
I can build it up here if you want.
Yeah, sure.
Here we go.
Yep. And so,
by the way, okay. Yeah, I think that's the single most impressive detail in the gospel. Like from all of the confirmed details in the gospels, for me, I think this is the one that is the most impressive one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you kind of know where I'm going then. Yeah. So it says, "Now Herod in the 18th year of his reign, and after the acts already mentioned, undertook a very great work, that is to build of himself the temple of God and make it larger in compass and raise it to a most magnificent altitude, as esteeming it to the most glorious of all his actions." And so it says in the 18th year of his reign. And so that's when he began the construction. And so based on this date, Jesus' initial confrontation in the temple at the start of his public ministry happened at around 27 to 28 AD. And if you go to Luke chapter 3, verse 1, it says that this actually happened in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea and so on and so forth, and Herod being the tetrarch of Galilee. And so Augustus Caesar actually passed away in 14 AD. However, in the autumn of 12 AD, as Augustus named Tiberius co-emperor to ensure a smooth transition of power, which is something that we learned about in Suetonius, Tiberius, his book on Tiberius, I believe it's chapters 20 through 21. And so this places John the Baptist's public ministry at around 26, 27 AD, shortly before he indirectly reveals for Jesus discussion with the Jews about the temple, is what I'm trying to say. And so therefore, Jesus' public ministry starts nearly the same time John ends. And so what we're getting here is like basically John, Luke, Josephus, and Suetonius, however you pronounce it, people pronounce it differently, all kind of converging on the same thing, telling us this is when that particular temple was built, and this is when, how long Herod had been leading, and all that other kind of stuff. And so there's all of these different historical things that kind of fit together. It doesn't make it seem like he's just inventing something and moving it,
Right.
the way that these facts all fit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But there are some big names like scholar or even Christian names that disagree. I think maybe Michael Icona will disagree. I hope he has a different approach to harmonizing contradictions. And he has said that sometimes this kind of harmonization can feel forced and it's like doing violence to the text, because a natural reading of the Gospels, the entire thing, will make one think that the event just happened once. But if I may, maybe I can give briefly some reasons why I find this harmonization problematic. Like, for example, if there were two cleansings of the temple, how convenient is it that none of the Gospels mention both of them? How come all of them only mention once? Also, there is another thing. Many commentators have said that have placed this event as the kind of like the catalyst that led to Jesus' arrest. And I think this makes more sense if it happened only once than if it happens like multiple times. And the third thing, I saw a Spanish philosophy video, and his main argument is that there are differences in the narration between John and the others. But I think the difference can be explained by John's well-known tendency to write things differently. Mike Licona has said that John is like the problem child of the gospel. Like there is some things he kind of is a bit different from the others. So, and the difference, they don't really exclude each other. Like if skeptics were pointing at one event and showing this difference, apologists will be saying like, oh, John choose to focus on different things and synoptics focusing on another things. Like, I mean, like I don't think this is very strong, so I'm not sure about this. But okay, yeah, that's all.
Sure. I mean, I'll answer one of those real quick. Is like, why didn't the synoptics mention it at the beginning? Well, I mean, I think that's just kind of a weak argument from silence. And so, just because they didn't mention it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't happen. We know that, right? And so,
yeah,
there's like. Marco Polo traveled to China. He didn't mention the Great Wall of China. Like we have Ulysses S. Grant was the Civil War general for Abraham Lincoln, but he never mentions the Emancipation Proclamation. And so when we just look at history in general, we know that there's just sometimes things that just go unmentioned. And so the other thing too is like, like Jesus is doing a protest here. I mean, protesters protest more than once oftentimes. It doesn't say that he was like, it could have been a small section of the temple. We don't necessarily have to assume that he would have been arrested on the spot. I mean, even in Mark's gospel, he's not arrested on the spot or anything else like that. And so yeah, I just don't find those to be like very persuasive arguments at all.
Okay.
Jonathan, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I completely agree with what you said. In fact, if you want to do a more detailed discussion, if you want to read a more detailed discussion of this, I recommend reading Lydia McGrew's book, Testimonies to, The Eye of the Beholder. She discusses this in some detail in The Eye of the Beholder.
Okay.
She also has some videos. She has some videos on her channel on the temple cleansing specifically that would definitely answer your question in a lot more depth. But yeah, I mean, there's just people who are, I think, kind of making leaps. I don't think we necessarily have to say that even the temple cleansing was what led to the crucifixion necessarily. I mean, Mark, Matthew, Luke, they don't like make that necessarily explicit into the synoptics. And even though that was him kind of poking his finger in their eye, there were many things that were already leading to that. Basically, I mean, right before that in Mark's gospel, or right after that, he talks about, he makes himself out to be the Son of God. He talks about all these different prophets that have come, and they were rejected and were killed and all that other stuff. And he's like, then he refers to in the parable of the Son finally coming and giving them a final chance to repent, and they killed him too. And so I think he was constantly, it was just a period of whatever, 3 years of him kind of already sticking his finger in their eye and upsetting them, claiming, authority over the temple, in different parts of the gospel. Him basically making divine claims and different things like that, calling himself the Son of Man, and so it was an accumulation. I think people are kind of reading that into it a little bit. I'm not saying that it doesn't have any part,
but okay, but calling yourself the Son of God, is this something that the Romans will be bothered by, or sounds like something that will bother the Jews more, but wouldn't get the Romans involved?
Notice also in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus actually enters Jerusalem the very next day after the temple cleansing. So this whole idea that Jesus would have been arrested on the spot, etc., and so so the temple cleansing could only have been at the end of Jesus' ministry, which precipitated his arrest and his execution. That doesn't really make sense, even if just reading Mark on its own terms. And he enters Jerusalem the very next day, and he continues, teaching for a few more days prior to his death.
I'm not sure, but I think even in Spanish philosophy, I agree with this in the video. I will have to rewatch the video because I actually made a response video to that. But I think even in Spanish philosophy agrees with this point that the second temple, that it was like a catalyst that kind of contributed a lot to his arrest. But I will just rewatch it.
Yeah, like I'm saying, I'm not saying that it wouldn't have a part. And you asked earlier, like, wouldn't this like have bothered the Romans, himself calling the Son of God? Well, no, they brought him before the Romans and were basically saying that he was making himself out to be a king, and different things like that. They were trying to say that he was, a usurper kind of thing, and that, if you allow this, that you're no friend of Caesar, and all that other kind of stuff. And that just leads to another undesigned coincidence within this same story, that I think it causes one to think that this isn't just some sort of theological invention or John moving it, because in Mark 14:58, when they're bringing fake charges against Jesus, they say, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands." Well, nowhere in the Synoptic Gospels do we have any prior justification for this accusation. But when we do look at John and the preceding verses that we just had, the Jews said to him, "What signs do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And so John actually gives us the original statement of Jesus, but not its accusation. And the Synoptics seem to give us a garbled accusation that doesn't give us the actual original statement. So neither of these look like they're copied from one another. So you take the external confirmation that we provided here, as well as the undesigned coincidence that we have between the Synoptics and John. It sure seems to me like this particular event was historical. There's the same kind of markers that we have pointing to with, like, say, the raising of Lazarus. And so yeah, I just don't have any reason to think that they moved it. And if didn't feel free to move these things, then that tells us that, they're trying to give us real history and not just, contorting the facts to whatever.
It seems to me that the objection engages in a priori history, where you insist ahead of time what would have happened and let that trump what the clear testimony of our primary sources.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Well, yes, it answers the second question. But okay, my original question then: do you believe there is anything in the Gospels that they put it there or they changed it because of theological reasons, or do you believe that they didn't do that?
No, we don't believe they did that at all. I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not an inerrantist, so I do think that there are a small handful of mistakes in the Gospels which result from a minor good faith error. But like, such as a variation in eyewitness memory and that sort of thing. But I don't think that the authors ever deliberately make changes to the fact.
Yeah,
okay, I see.
Yeah, we don't think so either. Usually, if they're trying to highlight some sort of theological significance, they have no hesitation to say, and this was to fulfill the prophets or different things like that. Even to the point where sometimes people are like, "Oh, well, that seems a little bit strained," like, "Out of Egypt I've called my son," like.
Yeah.
But that wasn't considered a messianic prophecy by any of the rabbis. What we have record in the Targums, Talmud, and any of the Jewish writings. And so Matthew is probably talking about this because this is something that actually happened. And we do have all kinds of, like, external confirmations that lead us to think that the flight to Egypt was something that really did happen. So yeah, I don't think that they're changing anything for theological reasons. I think that they're trying to tell it as they know it, and when they do see theological significance, they don't have any problem bringing that out. But I don't think that it's something that they're deliberately doing. So hopefully that helps. Did you have
Okay.
any follow up with that before
Yeah,
we
yeah.
move on to the next?
No, that was all. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it. All right. Good to have you.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. So Raves, could you real quickly, if possible, if you can't, I know you made a comment in the private chat. Could you just wave, make sure I know you're a human and not a if not, if you don't have a camera. I saw your question, so I think you're fine. I'll trust you, buddy. All right. Oh,
Hi.
it looks like that's me at work there. Anyway, go ahead, man. What's up?
Hi, guys. It's a pleasure to talk with you, Eric. I'm a big fan of your channel. Hi,
Thanks.
Dr. Jonathan.
Hey.
So, I wanted to ask about the story of the woman caught in adultery.
Mhm.
Like, I have watched a lot of videos of inspiring philosophy and other apologists talking about it. It wasn't exactly in the first manuscripts, and I thought, couldn't this be a red flag for the reliability of the Gospels? Like, opens the chance of the skeptics say, so the authors are willing to invent this stuff to make Jesus look more uh, miraculous or divine.
No, I mean, if John 7:53 through 8:11 is probably not originally part of John's gospel, as most textual critics are agreed, and so it doesn't. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that the story is fictitious. I don't know. There's scholars divide on that. There are some scholars who argue that the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery is in fact historical, and it made its way eventually into the Gospel of John. But it doesn't bear on the credibility of the author of John one way or the other, because it doesn't belong in the Gospel of John. Now, there's very strong reasons for thinking that this account is not original to John. In particular, the fact that it's not found in the earliest, most reliable manuscripts. The fact that there's there's a manuscript where it's found in the Gospel of Luke. It's found in different parts of John's Gospel, so it's like this block of text searching for a home. And what's interesting is that John 7 and 8 are set during the Feast of Tabernacles, and this story of the woman caught in the act of adultery between John 7:53 and 8:11 actually interrupts the narrative flow. It flows much more seamlessly if you remove it. In fact, let me just mention, because it relates to this discussion, a particular external confirmation that so in John 7 and 8 are set during the Feast of Tabernacles. We know this from verse 2. The Jewish Feast of Booths was at hand. And you might recall, as you read through the Gospels, that Jesus loves to teach from the occasion, from the surroundings, from the environment. What's interesting about John 7 and 8 is that he does this, although the text never makes that explicit. You have to know some of the historical background. So in verse 37, it says, on the last day of the feast, a great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone thirsty, come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart flow rivers of living water. Now, and in John 8, this is just immediately after this problematic text. It says, again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Now, this also pertains to the Feast of Tabernacles. This whole text here, this whole block of text, is a bit of an intrusion into the narrative flow. If we go over to the Babylonian Talmud, we get a little bit of the historical background to the Feast of Tabernacles. So the Babylonian Talmud is a compilation of Jewish traditions, and this is a particularly ancient tradition concerning the practices associated with the Feast of Tabernacles. This is found in Tract Sukkah, chapter 5. It says, he who has not witnessed the rejoicings of the water drawing has throughout the whole of his life witnessed no real rejoicing. At the expiration of the first holiday of the festival, they descended into the woman's court, where a great transformation was made. Golden candelabra were placed there, with 4 golden basins at the top of each, and 4 ladders were put to each candelabrum, on which stood 4 lads from the rising youth of the priesthood, holding jars of oil containing 120 lugs, with which they replenished each basin. The cast-off breeches and belts of the priests were torn into shreds, where wicks were still lighted. There was not a court in Jerusalem that was not illuminated by the light of the water drawing. Pious and distinguished men danced before the people, lighted flambeaux in their hands, and sang hymns and laws before them. And the Levites accompanied them with harps, psaltery, cymbals, and numberless musical instruments. So apparently there was this water drawing ceremony. In fact, the previous chapter in this same tract in the Talmud indicates that water was taken from the pool of Siloam and it was poured over the altar in the temple. And we just learned that this water drawing ceremony associated with the Feast of Tabernacles was connected to this festival of lights where many candelabra were lit. And so this then adds color to Jesus' statements in John 7 and 8, where he says, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. And I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. But John never makes that connection explicit. You have to know the historical background. Now, John elsewhere sometimes takes time out to explain, particularly for the sake of his Gentile readers, some of the Jewish background and customs. He doesn't do so here. And so you can't necessarily count on his Gentile readers making the connection to the Feast of Tabernacles. And then these practices actually ended in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple. So he can't necessarily even count on some of his Jewish readers making the connection. Some of whom might be too young to remember the festival. And so the Babylonian Talmud here actually helps to corroborate the account in John 7 and 8 by adding this historical background. And this is very consistent with the way that Jesus is observed to teach elsewhere, where he likes to draw from the occasion, from the surroundings, from the environment. He does this very consistently, very routinely throughout all four Gospels. And so this further support, aside from the textual evidence, suggests that this block of text doesn't really belong here because it's kind of an intrusion into the narrative. It flows much more seamlessly if you just remove it.
Okay. Thanks, Doc. Thanks, Eric. It was all.
As for the general textual integrity of the New Testament, this is not particularly controversial. I mean, scholars generally agree that what we have in the New Testament is a substantial representation of what was originally written down. When there are, this is one of two major blocks of text that are inserted into the New Testament, the other being in John 16, verse 9 and following. We recognize those because when you have textual interpolations into the New Testament, it leaves a paper trail, right? It would be very difficult for someone to deliberately insert a text into the New Testament without leaving a paper trail, particularly given the widespread nature of the distribution of the manuscripts, the fact that it's under no governing control, so we have a free transmission of the New Testament, and the fact that you have major quotes from the New Testament by the early church fathers, and they are accessing manuscripts that are distributed all around the Mediterranean at the time. And so you would have a major task on your hands if you wanted to insert a block of text into the New Testament. You would have to gather up different manuscripts in different regions of the world and also edit quotations in the early church fathers without leaving a paper trail, and that'd be quite difficult to do. And you have multiple independent streams of transmission that converge upon a substantially common text. So scholars are generally agreed that what we have in the New Testament is a substantial representation of what was originally written by the original authors.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So where people are saying, oh, well, this is like an interpolation, therefore there's this widespread conspiracy and you don't know like what is made up in the text and what isn't. Well, we know that's fake, or that we know that that's not true just from the fact of textual criticism, like Jonathan said. But then also all of the positive evidence that we've given so far, like the external confirmations, the undesigned coincidences, if these are just fabricated stories, those aren't the kind of things that we would expect to see. And so if the Gospels were just corrupted beyond repair and are just like a bunch of like mostly just a bunch of made up stories or different things like that, that it would be surprising to see the kind of evidence that we are seeing, that we've been just kind of giving examples of throughout this whole stream. So does that help?
Yes, thanks guys. It's a pleasure to talk with you. God bless.
All right. Thanks,
bye.
Buddy. Yep. All right. All right. So let's see. Let's see who is next. Marius. Fazal, stay with me, bud. If you want, I can bring you up. But I got Marius who's had a question about I believe it was authorship of the Gospels. And so yeah, if you're on stage, bud. So yep, I can hear you.
All right. So my question is basically about if we can trust the writings of the church fathers when we're using them as external evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. Because from what I've seen, writings from like Clement of Rome, who was writing in the 1st century, His manuscript tradition was his his manus- his earliest manuscript was somewhere in the 5th century. So there's like a 400-year gap between his time of writing and the manuscript edition that we have. Something similar with Ignatius or Polycarp. And I'm just wondering, how can we trust the church fathers' writings when you're using them as evidence for the authorship of the Gospels? Is that okay? Is that
Yeah, no,
that makes
that's fine.
sense?
We're talking about historicity, and so we were kind of basically talking about like miracles in the New Testament, but that's totally fine. It's a valid question. And so, as far as like the authorship of the Gospels, and just the external fathers, I would say one of the things based on like the kind of evidence that we've been giving so far with like the external corroboration with history, like the example that Jonathan just gave, or some of the examples that we gave in the book of Acts with the undesigned coincidences between Paul's letters in the book of Acts and different things like that. Something like traditional authorship would have to be true, because what we're seeing in these accounts is that these are people who show themselves to be close up to the facts and are familiar with the witnesses, and they're trying to get the truth right, and that they're pretty knowledgeable people, right? And so that right there tells us that something like traditional authorship has to be true. Now, Justin Martyr talks about, he calls the Gospels like the memoirs of the apostles in several different places, even though he doesn't necessarily like exactly name the authors. And so like what he says very early on kind of like backs up what we're saying. Now he does quote at one point, I believe it's Mark 3:17 or 3:7, where he's talking about the list of the disciples, and it's 3:17, and he calls James and John by their nickname, which is the only time we have them called by their nickname. Boanerges, are the sons of thunder, right? And then right after that, he says something about the memoirs of Peter, and all the church fathers are pretty much unanimous that like Mark was Peter's like interpreter or scribe or both. And so just from this kind of evidence alone, not to beat a dead horse, but something like this has to be true, right? And then you have all the geographical diversity and the early attestation for the authorship of the Gospels. You don't just have like Irenaeus, who a lot of skeptics have this idea that like he just had like this, like he was like this bully who just is like, I have this magic pen and I'm going to ascribe that these are the authors of the Gospels, and you know, like everybody has to accept that. No, he's writing in Gaul, which is modern day France. Clement of Alexandria, who is a contemporary, gives the exact same attribution of authorship in Alexandria in Egypt. And so there's reasons to think that they're independent. You also have Papias of Hierapolis, who mentions Matthew and Mark and probably John. You have you have the
Tertullian of Carthage, of course.
Tertullian of Carthage. You have the Muratorian Fragment, which was probably a Roman document. You have Justin Martyr, who was writing in Rome, and he kind of moved around. He was in Samaria, he was in Jerusalem. He kind of moved around, who at least gives us some clue. And then you have all the early manuscript evidence, which we don't have any anonymous gospels. Every gospel that we have that has some sort of attribution has it attributed to our 4 different authors. And so
every manuscript is sufficiently complete.
Complete, yeah. That's what I meant to say.
And I'd also note, Justin Martyr talks about the memoirs of the apostles, which are also called gospels, and he tells us that these memoirs of the apostles or gospels were composed by the apostles and those, or the apostles of Jesus and those who followed them. So that's consistent with Matthew and John being the apostles, and those who followed them being Mark and Luke. And in fact, his own pupil or student Tatian composed the Diatessaron, where is a harmony of the 4 gospels, which are our 4 canonical gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which suggests that Justin Martyr knew. In fact, Justin Martyr also tells us that the memoirs of the apostles were read at the churches, and so it seems very probable that there was early attribution of authorship, particularly given the wide geographical spread of that distribution. Irenaeus I see as a very credible source, because Irenaeus tells us that he knew Polycarp, and that Polycarp was personally acquainted with the disciples. So he tells us, for example, in Against Heresies. Can you pull up my screen again, Eric?
Yeah.
And this is from Irenaeus Against Heresies, book 2 and chapter 3. He says, but Polycarp also was not only instructed by apostles to converse with many who had seen Christ, but was also by apostles in Asia appointed bishop of the church of Smyrna, whom I also saw in my early youth. For he tarried on earth a very long time, and when a very old man, gloriously and most nobly suffering martyrdom, departed this life, having always taught the things which he had learned from the apostles, and which the church had handed down, and which alone are true. There's also a fragment from Irenaeus, which is from a now lost work, but it's quoted by Eusebius, the church father. He tells us that this is from Irenaeus. He tells us, for I have a more vivid recollection of what occurred at that time than of recent events, and as much as the experiences of childhood keeping pace with the growth of the soul become incorporated with it, so that I can even describe the place where the blessed Polycarp used to sit and discourse, is going out to and is coming in, his general mode of life and personal appearance, together with the discourses which he delivered to the people, also how he would speak of his familiar intercourse with John and with the rest of those who had seen the Lord, and how he would call their words to remembrance. And so apparently Irenaeus knew personally Polycarp, who in turn knew the apostles, and in particular John is mentioned here. And so Irenaeus is in a good position to know about the authorship of the Gospels because of his one remove from the apostles. And of course, it's consistent with some of the internal lines of evidence as well for the traditional attribution of authorship. In fact, the author of Acts, as we've discussed, was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. There's just overwhelming evidence for that. And that being the case, Luke actually gives us a short list of those traveling with Paul to Rome in the book of Colossians and also in the book of Philemon. And so this helps us to try to decipher who the most plausible candidate for authorship is. In fact, I'll share my screen here again to show this list in Colossians of those traveling companions of Paul en route to Rome. If you could pull that up, Eric.
Yeah.
So in Colossians. So in Colossians 4, verses 10 through 14, it says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom he received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus. These are the only men of the circumcision among my fellow workers for the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you, always struggling on your behalf in his prayers, that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has worked hard for you and those in Laodicea and Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. And this same list is given in the book of Philemon, which was composed around the same time as Colossians during Paul's Roman imprisonment there, now around 60 to 62 AD. So this gives us a short list of those present with Paul in Rome, which includes Aristarchus, Mark, Jesus, who is called Justus, Epaphras, Luke, and Demas. Now, which of these is the most probable candidate? Well, Aristarchus is distinguished from the author on the way to Rome in Acts 27, verse 2. So if we look up, it says that embarking on a ship of Adramyttium, which is about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea accompanied by Aristarchus. So the author is distinguished from Aristarchus. He's also distinguished elsewhere as well, in Acts 20, for example, verse 4 and 5. Demas is also an unlikely candidate because he deserts Paul, according to 2 Timothy 4:10. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. So he's not a very likely candidate. The author also seems to be a Gentile, given that Luke likely traveled with Paul to Jerusalem as a representative of the Gentile churches in Acts 20. And also from his geographical competence and his interpretation of Judaism, most scholars are agreed that he was not a Palestinian Jew. And so that would exclude the men of the circumcision that Paul lists in Colossians, which would be Aristarchus, Mark, and Jesus, who is called Justus. And Craig Keener observes in his commentary on Acts that the author's lack of interest in the Lycus Valley in Colossae may render Epaphras unlikely. He was said to be a Colossian, Epaphras, who was one of you. And so that makes Luke the most probable candidate, which is consistent with the patristic evidence. The author of John also purports himself, in his own words, to be an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry. We see this in 1 John, for example, which is written by the same author as the fourth gospel, is pretty widely agreed. That he says that which was from the beginning, which we have seen and heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands, concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it, testify to it, and proclaim to you the eternal life, which is with the Father, and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with the Son Jesus Christ. He also tells us that he was the beloved disciple in John 21, where he says, this is verse 24, this is a disciple who's bearing witness about these things and has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. So, and the various marks of verisimilitude throughout the Gospel of John are consistent with his identification as the disciple whom Jesus loved, and the most probable candidate for the disciple whom Jesus loved turns out to be John, the son of Zebedee. So, which is consistent with patristic evidence. Mark is also a very unlikely choice of a false attribution of author, given that Mark is best known for having abandoned Paul in Pamphylia and causing a split between Paul and Barnabas. He's mentioned like a couple of times in Acts. In Acts 13, verse 13, he abandons Paul in Pamphylia and goes to Jerusalem. And then in Acts 15, as a result of that, it actually causes a split between Paul and Barnabas. The apocryphal gospels routinely attribute their gospels to high-profile characters like Peter, Thomas, and so on. But why attribute it to John Mark, especially since the early church unanimously claimed that Mark received his material from the eyewitness testimony of Peter? In fact, Justin Martyr, as we discussed earlier, as Eric mentioned, also talks about the Gospel of Mark, calling it the Memoirs of Peter. Well, why call it the Gospel of Mark? Why not just call it the Gospel of Peter? That seems to be rather strange if you have liberty to just make up fictitious gospel attributions. So for those reasons and many others, I'm persuaded of the traditional gospel authorship.
Another thing, too, that Tertullian said is that we don't receive anonymous. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Sorry for interrupting you, but
no, you're totally fine.
But what I wanted to ask is, how can you trust that? How can you trust, for example, that First Clement, what Clement wrote in First Clement in the first century, is what we have today?
First Clement?
Clement of Rome, First Clement.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead, Jonathan.
I mean,
you're good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a specialist on textual criticism, and my understanding is that the manuscript evidence for First Clement, I think, is fairly sparse, but as it is for much literature, much ancient literature. So, I mean, I don't make a dogmatic assertion that there are no changes to First Clement. I mean, certainly there's no particular reason to think, there's no positive reason to think that there are interpolations in First Clement, and so scholars don't argue that because there's no reason to think that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, that would be kind of separate. I mean, we're talking about authorship of the Gospels here. Clement certainly quotes Matthew, but there's not, and he is anonymous. And we're identified this throughout. He's identified through church tradition and different things like that as being the author of First Clement. But yeah, it doesn't really have.
I mean, there are several manuscripts of First Clement. There's a 5th century codex. There's 2 12th century manuscripts. There's an 11th century Latin version. There's 2 Coptic versions. So as I said, it's much more sparse than for the New Testament, as you might expect, because the early church did a lot of copying of the New Testament. But I mean, many ancient sources are sparse in terms of their textual integrity, and we don't just get to say, well, there were edits when we don't have any reason to think that there were edits. I mean, what's the reason for thinking that to be the case? And First Clement, by the way, doesn't tell us who wrote the Gospels, so I'm not quite sure.
I don't. That's what I was.
He does quote extensively he does quote quite a bit from the New Testament, But he doesn't tell us who the gospel authors were. So I'm not quite sure what the connection is to this particular issue.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the fact that basically church we attribute authorship based on what the church fathers said. That's why I mentioned Clement, even though I'm a bit ignorant on which one.
Because Clement is also from church
an apostolic
tradition.
father. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, no, I understand. I just, like I said, because of all the internal evidence that we gave, I think there's good reasons to think that the traditional authorship is correct. We definitely would say that something like church authorship has to be, or traditional authorship has to be correct. And there's just not any really good reasons to. Usually critical scholarship, they only engage with it from like, just kind of bad objections like, why doesn't Matthew identify himself and say, hey, I'm Matthew? Why does he refer to himself in the third person? Why does he copy from Mark's gospel about his own calling? I mean, all of those things we've answered like many times and just aren't really very strong objections. And so I don't think like the critical case really has a whole lot going for it. And just all the evidence points in the same way for traditional authorship.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And the patristic attestation to traditional authorship is only part of the argument. There's also the internal evidence. And I actually repose much greater weight on the internal evidence, particularly the evidence that indicates that the authors are individuals who are very well informed and close up to the facts and habit of being truthful, which is consistent with the traditional authorship. And there is pretty good internal indicators for the traditional attributions of authorship, especially in the case of the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John. And since the early church appear to have at least got John and Luke right, and Mark is a very surprising choice if you're just fictitiously attributing authorship, that suggests to me that they actually were well informed about the and had good reasons to believe in traditional authorship, which is why they give us those attributions.
Does that help?
Yes, that helps a lot. Thank you very much for answering my question.
Yeah, awesome, man. Thanks for coming up.
See you.
Yep. All right. So we have Bazal. Bazal, can you, I don't know if you can wave or anything. I don't know if he still has a question. Bazal says he's a Muslim. So we'll see what he has. We're going to try and we got to keep things on topic as far as historicity of the Gospels and different things like that, because that is what we are discussing today. You don't have to have a webcam. You asked your question behind stage. So what's up, Fazal? What you got on your mind?
Yeah, hi, Testify. So thanks for having me.
Yeah.
So, okay. So I need to ask, so what is the New Testament view of the gospel? Like, as an example, when I go through the New Testament, I can see Jesus is teaching the gospel. Jesus is already having the gospel. Like if I go to the Mark chapter 1, it says the John was arrested and Jesus came into Galilee teaching the gospel. So the New Testament idea is like Jesus already have the gospel. Am I correct in that opinion?
So you already had the gospel? I mean,
Yeah, that's what.
Jesus.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah.
So are you asking like what exactly is the gospel, or I guess I'm not.
So he referenced Mark 1, which says in the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I mean, the gospel is the English translation of the Greek word evangelion, which means good news. So it begins the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And Mark's about to tell us about this good news, namely Jesus' ministry, his life, his death, his resurrection from the dead.
Yeah, I mean, like, what you mean by the gospel? What I'm asking, like, Jesus already has the gospel, or do you think the entire New Testament is the gospel, or New Testament has the gospel?
Jesus is the subject of the gospel, right? Gospel literally means, as I said, evangelion is the Greek word, and it means good news, literally, right? So you could also translate it as just good news, and maybe that's an easier translation. And so there's good news concerning what Jesus has done for us on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. That is the good news about which the New Testament speaks.
It's recording the gospel. It's recording Jesus's message and his deeds and what he's done. And so, which in Geo, by the way, is just a transliteration from the Greek gospel, which is just evangelion, like Jonathan said. And so, does that make sense?
Yeah, my point is Jesus is teaching the Injil. So now my point is when I see my scripture and the New Testament, they agree on what is Injil. So both have the same concept of Injil because when I see the New Testament, like Jesus is teaching Injil, disciples are receiving the Injil from the Jesus. So Quran say the same thing. The Jesus was given the Injil. So when I see the Injil, the Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran has the same concept. So that's what I can see.
So let me ask you a question. In the in your belief, like what is the Injil? What is the gospel? What is the message? How does it differentiate from, say, the Torah? Because it often, like when you look in different verses of the Quran, it talks about that like Jesus had the gospel and he was confirming what was before it, which is the Torah. So what's the difference between Torah and Injil?
Yeah, Torah mean that what was given to Moses. So Injil mean what was given to Jesus. So
Okay,
what
but
was given means
what is the message though? How are the messages different, or are the messages the same, or what are the message? Because if you're just reading the Quran, you're not going to know the what specifically did Jesus teach that's gospel in comparison to the law.
And in particular, remember that there are various texts in the Quran, Surah 1094 to give one example, there's many others, that indicate that the Christians that came before Muhammad have access to the Injil, that they're able to read it, and they're able to judge the content of Muhammad's message by the contents of their own previous scriptures, in particular the Injil and the Torah. And so, in your understanding, Fazal, what are the Christians before Muhammad's time reading that differs from what we have in our New Testament?
our point of view is New Testament has the Injil. That means some of the New Testament has some of the teaching of Injil. So we don't say entire New Testament is Injil. So that's our concept. So Injil means teaching of Jesus, his commandments. Like you can find in New Testament Jesus teaching something, Jesus saying you can work on Sabbath, you don't need to wash the hands, you have to keep the commandments. So these are the teachings. So that is what we call Injil, the teaching of Jesus. So these teachings can be found in the New Testament.
Okay, so here's a problem then that I have. So in the New Testament, in the Gospels, so let's consider some of what Jesus says. So in Mark 8, for example, he says, in verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, but turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Now, this is a very unlikely text to be invented, in particular given the fact that it involves a twofold rebuke. Peter, who's one of the leaders in the early church, rebukes Jesus, and then Jesus turns and rebukes Peter, going so far as to call him Satan or adversary. It seems very unlikely that this would be invented. And yet Jesus predicts ahead of time his impending violent death and indeed his resurrection from the dead. President, I'm getting a lot of static from your end. Maybe you can mute. The Quran, of course, as you know, in Surah 4, verse 157, indicates that the Messiah is, or Jesus is not killed, right? And so this is a problem for the Islamic interpretation, because if Jesus predicts, and this is just one, I just gave you one example of several I could give you, where Jesus predicts ahead of time his impending violent death and indeed his resurrection from the dead, then one of two things has to be true. Either Jesus was in fact killed by crucifixion, which contradicts Surah 4 verse 157, rendering Islam false, or he was not killed by crucifixion, which renders him a false prophet, which also makes Islam false. So how would you get out of that sort of dilemma?
Yeah, because when it comes to that verse, because in New Testament we can find so many places, so many verses. These were read into the mouth of Jesus. Right, as an example, like the adulterous woman. That incident was not in the earliest Gospels, right? They were later added. So my thing is, when it comes to like, we cannot believe everything in the New Testament what Jesus says. Something were read into the mouth of Jesus.
But I just gave you an argument for thinking that the account in Mark 8 is historical. And in fact, we've got, of course, the broader arguments for the general reliability of these sources. And we also touched on earlier if you were on the stream at that point, Jesus' statement in John 2, where he says, destroy this temple, rebuild it in 3 days, which of course is referring to his impending death and resurrection from the dead. And we showed how that is an historical saying of Jesus. And so we have a very strong argument for that premise in the argument, in the case that, or the objection I'm making to Islam, that Jesus, in fact, as the New Testament asserts, predicted his impending violent death and resurrection from the dead, which is problematic given Surah 4, verse 157.
So what we're saying is that the Gospels are historically verifiable in a number of different ways, right? And so these don't look like the products of corruption or some later people adding things. And we already differentiated this between that and the story of the adulterous woman. And so all of the history that we have that's earlier, that predates the Quran, doesn't give us any reason to think that, like, oh, well, we should just take Muhammad's word for it 600 years later because he got a revelation, when we already have this, we already have all this information. We have a more reliable source.
Yeah, but when it comes to that, because the crucifixion and these kind of thing, like I'm always skeptic about these things, because like even if we see that the Christian perspective, like the disciple continue to keep the law until their death. So, but it doesn't make sense. So Jesus really died on the cross. Then why the disciple need to keep the law? Because Paul himself says, if you keep the law, Jesus died for nothing. But when I see the Christians, the actual disciples, the James, Peter, these disciples, they kept the law until their death. So that doesn't make sense. So if he died, why they need to keep the law, right?
Jesus did not come to abolish the law. If I look, and you mute yourself, it's just very noisy in the background there. Jesus does not come to abolish the law. In fact, he says as much in Matthew 5 at the Sermon on the Mount. He says, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not a iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. And it's a common misreading of Paul that Paul was antinomian. I disagree with that. I don't think that Paul was antinomian at all. I think that I mean, when he tells his audiences not to circumcise, he's talking to Gentiles. Like in Galatians, he's writing to a Gentile audience. When he tells the Colossians not to let anyone judge them by Sabbath day, etc., he's talking to a Gentile audience. When it comes to Jews, I do think that that New Testament Christianity encourages Jews to give up observing the law of Moses. In fact, in Acts 15, where they have the Jerusalem Council, the letter that is sent out to the Gentile believers is where it says that you basically don't have to become Jews in order to be Christian. It's addressed to Gentiles. It's not addressing Jews there. So they write.
While you're pulling it up,
Yeah.
the fact that Acts records Paul as a traveling companion, or Luke is a traveling companion of Paul, and Acts records this, and he's accepted by the 12 apostles. He is commissioned by the apostles to take up an offering for the poor saints in Jerusalem in Paul's letters, which is later confirmed in Acts that this is something that happens in his conversation with Agrippa in Acts 24. And constantly he's being identified with the apostles, accepted by the apostles, means that the Islamic narrative of Paul just being this fake apostle and completely opposing the message and all this other stuff is completely bunk. It's false. It's not true. There's no reason to even think that. Jonathan, I don't know if you found the reference that you're looking for there.
Yeah. So Acts 15 is the Jerusalem Council. Let me share a screen here.
Yep.
Here we go. Okay. So in Acts 15, it tells us, since so it seemed good to the apostles and the elders, the whole church, to choose men from among them and send them to Antioch. Paul and Barnabas, they sent Judas, called Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brothers, with the following letter: the brothers, both the apostles and the elders, to the brothers who are of the Gentiles in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia, greetings. Since we have heard that some persons have gone out from us and troubled you with words, unsettling your minds, although we gave them no instructions, it has seemed good to us, having come to one accord, to choose men and send them to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. We have therefore sent Judas and Silas, who themselves will tell you the same things by word of mouth. For it has seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay on you no greater burden than these requirements, that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you keep yourselves from these, you will do well. Farewell. This letter is addressed to the Gentiles. Is not talking about whether Jews have to observe the law or should observe the law.
In fact, in Acts 24, we see Paul taking a Nazirite vow.
Acts 21.
Acts 21, excuse me. Yeah, you're correct. Acts 21, Paul is interacting with James and ends up taking a Nazirite vow. And he's still, in many ways, a Torah observant Jew. And so, he's talking to a completely different audience and just saying, you don't have to do certain Jewish ritual things in order to be accepted by God.
Right. He circumcises Timothy in Acts 16 as well.
Yeah, but
and if you have a problem with that, I mean, even the Quran says, and I believe Surah 350, that Jesus came to make some things clean or halal, and that were previously haram. And so, like, your own scriptures even agree with that.
Yeah, we agree. Jesus came some of the law, but he never came to abolish the law. Like, it's still that his audience, his followers of Jesus, has to keep the commandments. So that's our point.
It's what we just agreed with you.
Yeah, but no, the point you're making is you're telling that Jesus died for the Gentiles, not for the Jews, because the point Paul is making is, if you keep the commandment, you don't need to. If you keep the laws, Jesus died for nothing. So no.
He's saying that you cannot be saved just by keeping the law and the law alone, because according to the commandments, every person has broken the commandments, right? And so when you read Romans 3, he says there's none righteous, there's no, not one. This is Romans 3:10. He's quoting the Psalms, and then he quotes the prophets, and he quotes all through Romans 3, and he says nobody has kept the commandments. None is good, and not one. All have sinned. This is Romans 3:23. And come short of the glory of God. And then in the next verse, it says they were justified freely by the grace through the sacrificial death of Jesus. And so, but that doesn't mean that you just don't keep the commandments after that. It just means that you could not, none of us could, you cannot stand before Allah on Judgment Day and say that it's my good works that are going to cause me to be accepted by you, because we've all sinned, and a just and holy God is going to punish sin. He's not just going to send you to hell for a short period of time. Jesus takes the penalty of the sin, and so that we're accepted by that. But we're not, because of that, we're not like, we don't keep the law, we don't keep the commandments, because Paul goes on in the very next chapters, and he talks about how by the Spirit, like the Romans chapter 8, by the Spirit we can have power to obey the commandments. But we do have a mediator between us and God, who, when we do fall short and when we do fail, he is the mediator, the go-between, who's going to say, my sacrifice was sufficient, my blood covers their sins, but we still have to get up, we still have to repent, and we still have to walk in the Spirit and crucify the desires of our flesh. That's Paul's gospel in kind of a nutshell.
Yeah. I got the point, but for me it is like kind of I cannot understand is why if the Jesus really died, then what's the point of disciple keeping the law? It don't make sense for me. Like both cannot go hand in hand.
The more important question, Fazal, is we have 4 historical documents that we can corroborate externally, that are historically reliable, that show themselves to be close up to the facts, knowledgeable and truthful. And so if these were corrupted narratives that were changed over time and different things like that, and deleted and had additions and all of these other things, we would not expect to find the plethora of the way that they confirm one another internally through subtle, undesigned things that interlock. And we can give you some evidence, like, pictures of that, or you could just see my library of videos that show that, between Acts and Paul's letters, between the Gospels themselves, and with just Roman history, Jewish history, and all of the other history. And so I would rather trust that by people who are witnesses or close to witnesses than some person who had a revelation 600 years later, far, far away in Arabia, who says that like it only appeared that Jesus was crucified, which to me just makes Allah kind of a deceiver for allowing it to appear as such and tricking his disciples. And it ended up starting a religion that is more responsible for shirk for 600 years than, and then some guy has to come and straighten it out while Allah sat in his hand for 600 years and sent no prophet. He could have raised up a prophet out of a speck of dust.
It's also a Gnostic view as well.
It is also, yeah, exactly. He's getting, it's borrowed. And so, like, why should I give up the New Testament when I have all of this historical corroboration over the Quran, which has historical errors, scientific errors, anachronisms, and borrowing from apocryphal sources and apocryphal stories, and not even, you know, I could go on and on and on. I mean, if you've seen the videos, I would take it. So like, I would trust that they're getting the gospel message right over Muhammad, which he doesn't even seem to know the difference between Torah and gospel. It's like, there's what's the good news? What good news is there if the law is bad news? The law is you have sinned, you deserve punishment, you deserve judgment. There is no good news necessarily from the law. It's just a revelation that you failed. And all he does is an anachronistic, like he goes back to we're going to get rid of this crucifixion stuff and this other stuff. Like there's no context of what even the gospel is in Islam. You guys don't even know what the gospel is. And then not only that, on top of all that, Muhammad the Quran tells us you have nothing to stand on if you don't stand on the gospel. Judge by the gospel. Like, you don't have anything to judge by unless you judge by the gospel. And we're like, okay, well, Islam is false then. Like, you know, like, what do you want us to do? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And so what I would really highly encourage you is look at the historical reliability for the Christian Injil, the four gospels, the New Testament, and the case for it. You can see Jonathan's work on this on his channel. You can, or definitely his blog, you can see the playlist of videos that I've made on this and different things like that. I'm going to continue to make those kind of videos. There are books and everything else that we could recommend. It's just like, I'm sorry, but when I look at this from an outsider's perspective, I just think like all of the evidence is on our side, and like I don't see any evidence on your guys' side. And so it's just like, what am I supposed to do?
No, I think, yeah. So like, my point is like, so first of all, like, so Quran do not deny the crucifixion. Quran confirm the crucifixion event, but Jesus was saved by a miracle. So when it comes to miracle, you don't confirm or you don't deny a miracle. So
Allah deceived and tricked Jesus' own followers because they seemed to, from the very get-go, preach that the crucifixion actually happened and that he was resurrected from the dead. And so, like, his own followers, who Allah says he would make uppermost, and that they would be successful until the day of resurrection, gets the very message wrong from the very get-go, because Allah made it appear that Jesus was crucified, but he was actually rescued, and like he was replaced with Judas or somebody else. Like that's conspiracy theory level of thinking. And like,
my point is the disciple never believed Jesus died. My point is the disciples believe Jesus was saved. That's why they kept on the commandments. That's my point in the beginning.
So there is nowhere between the 30 something AD and 600 AD where you see anybody, any gospel, any message, any group of followers at all who are teaching this message. None. Zero. You have Gnostics who reject the crucifixion, but they also say that the creator of the world is evil. they're Gnostics. They think that the creator of the world is evil. They think that Jesus is the good guy, and Yahweh or Allah, in your view, is the bad guy. He's evil and did a terrible job. They're the Ebionites. They believed in the crucifixion, and but they rejected the virgin birth. So there's nobody preaching that message. You have the Arians. They rejected Jesus as God, but they still worshipped him as the Son of God, and accepted him as crucified and as the Son of God, which is shirk. So you have the pagans. They definitely aren't true followers of Allah. And so you have the Jews. They rejected Jesus as the Messiah. So from 30 AD to 600 AD, there's not one gospel. We have Gnostic gospels. We have all this other stuff. We have all these other religious groups that we have historical records of. And not only that, your Quran tells us in 355 and 6114 that Allah would make them uppermost. And yet there is not one person in history that you can point to that is a true follower of Jesus, that is preaching the message that Jesus really wasn't crucified and rescued by Allah. Come on. Like I'm not trying to be mean, but it's just like, bro, like think about this for just a second. Like, do you see how insane this is to us? Like, there's who was a true follower of Prophet Jesus between 30 something AD and 600 AD? Give me one pre-Islamic source that I can find that actually preached the message that Jesus preached, and
Okay.
that lines up with the Quran.
Okay, so that's where the Ebionites and Nazarians come into place.
Okay, but the Ebionites, first of all, most of them reject the crucifixion or reject the virgin birth. A lot of them rejected the virgin birth. We have very little history about them other than what is mentioned in like a few church history sources that are critiquing them. And also, they believed that everybody who followed the law could become a Christ. And they also believed that Jesus had the Christ descend upon him at his baptism, and then he ascended off of him at his crucifixion. So they believed that he was crucified. And so like the Ebionites are not your friends here, and you don't know anything about what the Nazarenes believed other than they thought that we should keep the law. They didn't deny the crucifixion. They accepted the crucifixion, and they accepted so that just isn't going to work. And so uppermost dominant is not the Ebionites until the day of resurrection. Where are the Ebionites today? They don't they didn't exist. They were stamped. They were gone. There was nobody there.
I think maybe we should move on here because there are other people waiting, and also
we do have
audio
other
is
people
pretty
waiting.
poor.
So Bazal, I just want you to consider these things. I like talking about this, as people could probably tell, but there's just read the real Injil, bro. That's all I got to say. All right, thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
All right, Kevin, real quick. Kevin has a quick question. It's a little off topic. He said it's totally fine. I know what it is, so I'm happy to answer. And so, Kevin, thanks for waiting.
Hello. All right. So, like I said, I've been an atheist for about 19 years. So I'm coming from like a heavily skeptical point of view.
Sure.
And, I watched your videos and I think they're pretty great. I don't at this time really doubt the historical point of view of the New Testament, but I have like a little bit of difficulty wrapping my head around the divine part, in that,
Do you mean the miraculous part?
Yeah, the miraculous part. I have a little bit like of a difficult time wrapping my head around that. Recently, I've been going to church, studying the Bible and, praying, but like I haven't really seen any change. I know it's easy for a lot of people to just fall into it, but I haven't really been able to accept that the way they have. And I was just saying, like, is there any historical evidence of miracles? I know we have an empty tomb, but past that, I'm pretty uneducated on the topic.
Oh yeah, plenty. I mean, are you familiar, Kevin, with some of our arguments for Christianity, such as the case for the resurrection of Jesus, the conversion of Paul, other credibly attested New Testament miracles I summarized earlier at the beginning of this stream, the Christological trilemma argument, the argument for messianic prophecy, the argument for modern miracles. Are you familiar with those arguments already, or?
I'm vaguely familiar with the resurrection, but the others
Okay.
I'm not so much.
Sure. Eric, which one should we tackle here?
I would say, gosh, he's familiar with the resurrection. I almost am thinking maybe even modern miracles could be something that might be helpful. And so, are you familiar with any like accounts of modern miracles in Christianity at all?
Not really, no. But yeah,
Okay.
that seems like something I'd be able to latch onto.
Kind of wrap your head around. Sure.
Yeah.
Let me share my screen real quick here. Let's see. Oh, wrong one. There we go. Okay, I'm just going to run through like a few examples. This is like these are just some slides that I had for a talk with Jonathan. And so I'll skip through some of this stuff because we don't really need to.
All right, and I just want to say my phone's pretty low end. I don't know how it's going to react to you sharing your screen. So if I suddenly just disappear, I didn't leave or anything.
Okay. Yeah, no worries, man. If you have to, just listen and we'll know you're there or something. And so there are one of the ways that we can establish a modern miraculous healing, because I think one of the things that you kind of mentioned at the beginning is like you're familiar with the evidence for the resurrection and you've heard that, and you don't really have so much of a problem accepting some of the historicity of the New Testament and its reliability, but miracles are kind of crazy. And so if you just kind of think about it, like if these things are still happening in our modern day, then it's kind of like gives some information in the background to help us not look at these accounts and go, oh, that's weird. Because I know before I was a Christian, I was reading the New Testament, reading the Bible, and I was really interested. But every time I got to like a story, and like I thought Jesus was a very compelling character, and I liked his teachings. But when I would read like the stories of, say, like the raising of Jairus' daughter, or the healing of the woman with the issue of blood, I was just like, what is this? Like, is this just an invented story? Is this just a myth? Or are people just confused? Like, what is going on? And so, and I think that's why a lot of critical scholars, when they look at the New Testament documents, they have some like they turn their skepticism meter up a little bit extra high, because it's like, they're these supernatural things. But again, if we could establish that these things happen in our modern day, then I think it makes it a little easier of a pill to swallow. And so one way that we could establish a miraculous healing is using what we call the Lambertian criterion. This is actually something that the Roman Catholic Church uses to establish any kind of miracle report. And they're actually very scrupulous and can take sometimes even decades to confirm a miracle report. But I think it's just good for whether you're Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, whatever, a good criterion to use. And so the diagnosis and healing have to be medically documented. We actually need some medical documentation, not just somebody's word for it. The illness was organic and not psychosomatic. And so it can't just be something that's living in somebody's head. It has to be something that we know is real. The illness was progressive and showed no improvement prior to the healing. And the healing was permanent, not temporary. The healing was instantaneous and not gradual. And so, not like this long thing drawn out. And then the healing was complete and not merely partial. And so we don't want somebody who's not like actually healed and can like 3/4 of the way function, where before it was just like a quarter. We want something that's complete, and it needs to be spontaneous and not attributable to treatment. And so I'll give you a couple of case studies. This is Bruce Van Natta. Now, if you go to my channel from a year or so ago, I actually interviewed Bruce. He was a truck mechanic, and he had his lower abdomen crushed underneath a semi-truck. The jack gave way, and it crushed him right in his midsection, like on his waist. And he had several severed arteries. Survival was medically unexpected. He should have bled to death in 10 minutes. And subsequent medical studies show that he was the only person known to survive such injuries. He also reports actually physically leaving his body, looking down and seeing his friend like freaking out, and the paramedics had to bring him back to life a couple times and everything else. But that's not the miracle in itself. The miracle is that his small intestine was severely damaged. Most of it had to be removed, leaving only 121 centimeters. Now, the average, what you and I probably have, is around 600 centimeters. His ileum, which is key for digestion and absorbing nutrients and different things like that, was reduced from 350 to 25 centimeters. So he was unable to digest food properly. and his weight dropped from 180 to a buck and a quarter. Now, the ileum is your most critical part of your small intestines, as I already mentioned, for nutrient absorption. Bruce, according to the doctor report, and you can kind of see it on the screen here, maybe it might be kind of hard on a phone, but this is the doctor report. He only had 7% of what is normal. So he actually had a friend who woke up one morning and was praying. He believed that he heard a voice saying, "Go pray for Bruce." He ignored it because he didn't really want to buy a plane ticket from New York to Wisconsin, where Bruce Van Natta lives. Didn't really want to be inconvenienced, but the next day he prayed, and he just had that same strong sense, this kind of inner sense that he needed to pray for Bruce. And so he flew there. He prayed for healing. He commanded his small intestine to grow in the name of Jesus. Van Natta felt an electric jolt and was healed. His small intestine had doubled in length and became fully functional. This was actually confirmed by multiple radiologists. Now, there is one caveat that I should mention. It's really difficult to measure somebody's intestine because you'd really have to kind of take them apart and put them back together again. And there's just not a known way of doing that. But based on all the X-ray kind of information that we have, it's at least 50% or more, and he's able to fully function. Okay. Whereas before he had like hardly anything and was dying. So he was able to digest food. He was able to eat food. He was able to get off of drip feeding because that was the only way that he could be fed. And he remains healthy years later, defying all medical odds. And so a lot of times you might hear atheists say, well, why doesn't God heal amputees? Well, it would be nice and it would be really cool if we could have a case of somebody who was missing an arm, like a war veteran or something, and the arm grew back. But this is pretty darn close. And actually, your intestines are a more complicated organ than your arm. And so to me, I find to be a very compelling case. This passes all the criteria that I went through at the beginning. Now, somebody who Bruce knows, Chris Gunderson, Bruce, after receiving this miraculous testimony or miraculous healing, began to share his testimony. He was invited to churches to speak and, just kind of share. He was at a small church, I believe in Arizona, and this is where he met Chris Gunderson. Chris Gunderson at the time was a teenager, and the problem with Chris was at 2 weeks old, he experienced severe vomiting and was diagnosed with gastroparesis, needing feeding tubes. Gastroparesis is basically your stomach is paralyzed. You cannot digest food, okay? Like and that's why he was projectile vomiting. So it impedes stomach emptying. Medical technology manages symptoms but offers no cure, and it's basically a death sentence. Like you can live to be like maybe to your early 20s, and that's it. You're likely going to die. So surgeons added different like medical limbs and different things at 11 months to reroute stomach emptying, and he relied on a feeding tube for 16 years. But he struggled with inadequate nutrition. Now, my friend Than Christopoulos from Exploring Reality has an hour-long interview with him and Caleb Jackson where they talk to Chris specifically. So I would recommend you check out that video. And so basically Chris could eat, he could bite food, but he had to spit it out. That was the only way he could like enjoy the taste of food at all. And he couldn't even swallow it. Otherwise it would make him like violently ill. And so anyways, he attended a Pentecostal church. Oh, it was Oregon, not Arizona. He heard Bruce's testimony. Not Van Natta, his mother kind of dragged him up to the front against Chris's will. And it's like, he's going to pray for you. And he was like, okay. He was only the teenager at the time. Chris experienced pulsing and contraction sensations in his abdomen. That night, Chris went home and he ate his first oral meal without any complications at all, which is pretty amazing. The primary care physician and gastroenterologist couldn't explain the resolution. They did keep the feeding tubes in for a few more months. But after 4 months, they removed them. And this was actually documented as a medical case study. And so this is actually a quote from his doctor. It is difficult to explain his years of intolerance to oral feedings after fundoplication. I may have butchered that. But this has apparently resolved. I recommended leaving the gastronomy and jejunostomy, I might be getting that wrong too, devices for 3 months after the last time he used them to be sure that this is unneeded. I recommend an appointment to discuss discontinuing his tubes. His mother reports that he was prayed over in November and then began eating. He started eating on November 6, 2011, and he tolerated food. By December 3rd, he was completely off the J-tube feedings and eating normally. He does not require gastric decompression any longer. And so, and there's other quotes I have here. I'm not going to go ahead and read them, but this is just one example. There are dozens and dozens of these. Craig Keener has a good book called a popular level book. I can't remember. Miracles Today. That I think he shares more of the evidentially compelling ones. He has a big 2-volume series, but that's kind of more about volume. The quality ones are more in that. And then, I have a stream where I go into several other examples. But does that kind of help a little bit kind of realize that like actually these things do happen today, or they are reported today?
Yeah, I think that helps, but I mean, I have another question in that
Sure.
In my own life, all right, I had my grandma and she was a Christian, her 55 years until, one day she had a heart attack and her heart stopped. She died for like, I think 5-10 minutes. And she had been a Christian her entire life, but when I went to see her in the hospital, she was a little bit worried, and she spoke to me and she said, I've been a Christian all this time, but when I died, I didn't see anything, and that worries me. And from that point onwards, she sort of, doubted and eventually fell out of her faith. And I'm wondering, if these miracles are happening, right, why would it be possible for someone who, devoted themselves for like 55 years to have something like that happen? And then,
I mean, there are examples, as I'm sure you know, of reported near-death experiences where people do have experiences when they are brain dead or whatever on the operating table. They aren't necessarily, they're not dead. That's what we call near-death experiences, and so it's not very decisive evidence for the existence of an afterlife. But I'd argue that those instances are more evidentially forceful than someone's alleged non-experience, because I mean, one might simply not remember their near-death experience in the same way that we don't always remember our dreams. In fact, we often don't remember our dreams, and so it seems to me that someone's experience or someone's near-death experience is going to be more evidentially forceful in confirming a substance dualism and providing some evidence, at least for the afterlife, than with someone's non-experience and disconfirming it, if that makes sense.
All right.
Well, let me also say, like, I'm sorry that did happen, right? Because that's rough. But miracles don't necessarily even promise a better life. I mean, we were already talking about Paul. Paul experienced miracles and yet was persecuted from town to town and different things like that. And so we could ask kind of questions like, well, why does this person get a miracle, but this person doesn't, and all those other kind of things. But I think it's more difficult for the skeptic to explain this evidence away than to say explain away the problem of evil, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think.
I think Christianity also has far better resources to account for the cases where God apparently does not intervene than does naturalism to account for the cases where he apparently does. Right, so there's an evidential asymmetry. So someone's non-experience of a miracle is far less forceful evidentially than someone else's positive experience of a miracle, if that makes sense.
All right. So, like, I think that's fair, but my main point with that is that, obviously God would want to keep people close to him. So, in my grandma's case, and now, myself's case, that I'm trying to push myself towards Christianity on my own, if it's possible for God to, clear up that misconception, and he doesn't do that, and that leads to, people eventually estranging and, going somewhere else, not really believing or converting to a different religion, why wouldn't he clear up the misconception?
Well, go ahead, Jonathan.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, I mean, all the public evidence that we're talking about so far can serve as an anchor for somebody in a situation like that, because as Jonathan said, Christianity does have resources to say, like, hey, God does at times allow evil for various reasons. Even if sometimes we don't even know necessarily what those reasons are. I mean, that's almost part of the point of the book of Job. And so there is publicly available evidence that people can find, people can have. It would be nice if like Jesus appeared to everybody and it's just like, hey guys, it's me. I don't want you to go to hell. So there you go. But we could always imagine there being more evidence. But we do have sufficient evidence. And so even like in my case, like I've had a mother die prematurely, right when we found out we were pregnant with my first son. I've had other things, bad things happen to family members and different things like that. When I am put in a situation where it's like there's difficulty, I can look at this other kind of evidence and just be like, okay. And then I understand what I know theologically about Christianity and why he does allow suffering at certain times, and be like, I put those things together and I go, okay, well, again, there's just more evidence for this than there is, yeah, this doesn't make sense sometimes, or this hurts, or this is difficult. But that this doesn't just kind of knock all that and make it disappear. It might, you could question, you might have questions about it. But you just have to trust in the end that like Jesus came and entered into human sufferings himself, at the worst possible of human sufferings. And so he's not aloof and he's just. That may not be like the most philosophically airtight answer. I'm sure Jonathan probably has something to add there, but.
Kevin, would you be open to potentially doing like a more long form private discussion with us over Zoom at some point concerning these questions?
I would definitely be willing to do that. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Well, hop on over to talkaboutdoubts.com and submit a form there, and we'll reach out to you about scheduling a meeting to discuss these in much more detail, because obviously there's a lot more depth to these questions than we can unpack here.
All right. Got it. Yeah, that's pretty much all my questions, and I just want to say I really do appreciate what you do. You did sort of help me get into this and ground myself with at least the historical reliability, and yeah, that's all.
Yeah, no problem. I really appreciate you coming up, and like Jonathan said, fill out the form. We'd love to talk to you in more depth and just on a more personal level and answer your questions. So thanks for coming up.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye. Take care. All right. So I think we decided 2 hours, and so we're right at that mark. So I think that would be a really good place to end it. Pointing people to where they can go and get help again. Talkaboutdoubts.com, fill out the form. We can sit and take an hour and talk to you about any of these kind of doubts that you might have about New Testament reliability, the existence of God, the problem of evil, whatever might be bugging you. And so definitely avail yourself to those resources. Again, I've seen so many times where the lights have turned on, people have been helped, and it's just been a blessing for a lot of people. And so, Jonathan, do you have any final parting words before we go?
It was great to be on again, and please head on over to talkaboutdoubts.com and submit a form. We'd love to connect with anyone who is wrestling with doubts about Christianity, or who is exploring Christianity, or even if you're a former Christian and you want to explore whether there's a rational path back to faith. We'd love to share with you the public evidences of the gospel, which we contend is quite overwhelming, and we'd love to make you aware of it.
Awesome. All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in, and we will see you on the next one.